Paul was not a man of fame or power. He lived a quiet life in a small town where nights were long and silent. His job at the old observatory kept him away from noise and away from people. Most thought the observatory was useless, since larger. Research stations had modern machines and better funding. Yet Paul loved the old place. The large radio dish still worked. The telescope was slow but steady. For Paul, the silence of the night was worth more than anything else. On most nights, Paul sat in the control room listening to the hum of the machines. He would note the usual radio signals that came from stars, planets, or even distant satellites. They were nothing new to him. The patterns repeated, the waves were steady, and everything looked the same as yesterday. It was quiet work, but Paul liked it that way. One cold night in early winter, something unusual happened. As he tuned the radio receiver, he caught a sound that made him stop. At first it was faint, like broken static, but the longer he listened, the more it seemed to carry rhythm. It was not random. It came in small bursts, like words trapped in static. Paul leaned forward, turning the dial carefully until the sound grew stronger. The signal was unlike anything he had heard before. It had rise and fall, as if it was alive. The pauses between bursts felt like spaces between sentences. Paul pressed the record button and let the tape spin. His hands shook slightly, not from fear but from excitement. He knew stars could sing, in radio waves, but this was not that. This was different. After an hour of recording, Paul played the sound again. He heard something that made his chest tighten. The pattern repeated, and within the noise he could almost hear a plea. It was faint, buried under static, but he thought it said a single word. Help. Paul frowned, shaking his head. Maybe his mind was playing tricks. Many signals could sound like voices if one listened too long. Yet the sound came again. A short pause, then the same rhythm. Help. He stayed awake until dawn, listening again and again. He wrote down the exact time, frequency, and strength of the signal. When the sun rose, he carried his notes to the small university in town. He showed the recordings to two professors he knew. Both listened for a while, then smiled and shook their heads. They said it was interference from old satellites. They told him signals like this happened often, nothing to worry about. Paul tried to explain the repeating pattern, but they waved him off. In their eyes, Paul was just a lonely night worker who had spent too much time listening to machines. Walking back to the observatory, Paul felt a mix of doubt and determination. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was nothing, but a voice inside him whispered that it was not nothing. The signal had a weight to it. It carried feeling, like someone was calling across a great distance. That night, Paul returned to the observatory with fresh energy. He set up his old computer to analyze the signal. Using simple code, he broke down the bursts of sound into numbers. To his surprise, the numbers formed a repeating sequence. It was not random at all. It was a pattern, one that suggested intention. Whoever or whatever had sent it wanted someone to notice. For days, Paul studied the signal. He compared it with star maps and satellite paths. It did not match anything known. The frequency was too clear, too precise, as if aimed at Earth. Still, no one else cared. The university ignored his notes. The few friends he had only laughed and said he was chasing ghosts in the sky. Alone in the observatory, Paul felt the weight of the silence around him. The machines hummed, the tape spun, and the signal kept coming. Each night it grew slightly stronger, as if moving closer. Each night the word help seemed sharper. Paul could not explain why, but he felt a connection, forming. It was not only sound, it was emotion hidden in sound. Fear, sadness, and desperation seemed to flow through the waves. One evening, while drinking his third cup of black coffee, Paul noticed something new in the signal. Between the repeated calls for help, there was another word. Hunger. His hands froze above the keyboard. He replayed it again and again. The word was faint but clear enough. Hunger. Paul leaned back in his chair, staring at the blinking lights of the radio receiver. Whoever was calling was not only afraid, they were starving. They were weak. And for some reason, their voice had reached him, out of all the people on earth. As midnight turned to morning, Paul stepped outside the observatory. The night sky stretched wide and endless. The stars looked silent, but Paul knew one of them, or something near them, was speaking to him. The air was cold, and his breath turned to mist, but he barely noticed. He whispered softly, almost without thinking, "I hear you." Inside, the machine kept recording. The signal pulsed on, steady and alive, like a heartbeat lost in the dark. Paul knew then that his life had changed. The world was full of people who would not listen, but he could not turn away. Something out there was calling for help, and somehow he was the only one who could hear. Paul spent the next few nights at the observatory with little sleep. His days turned into a blur of coffee, notebooks, and the constant hum of the radio machine. He had listened to strange signals before, but never had he felt such urgency to decode one. The signal seemed alive. It was not just noise. It had rhythm, pattern, and meaning buried under static. He played the recording again and again. At first, he had only caught the word help. Then he had heard hunger. Now he wondered if more was hidden, waiting for him to uncover it. His old computer was slow, but it could still sort numbers and frequencies. Paul divided the signal into small sections, studying the gaps and bursts. To most, it was only sound. To him, it was language. On the third night, while the sky outside was filled with sharp stars, Paul made a discovery. He noticed the bursts were not evenly spaced. They repeated in groups, almost like sentences. One group repeated more often than the others. He marked it down carefully, tracing it on paper. When he compared the groups, he found slight variations, like letters forming different words. His heart raced. This was not random. Someone, or something, was speaking in a code. He leaned closer to the monitor, typing commands with shaky fingers. After hours of checking, he found 3 words repeated again and again: help, hunger, darkness. Paul sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. Help, hunger, darkness. The words painted a picture he could not ignore. Whoever sent this was afraid, starving, and trapped somewhere dark. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine. A stranded ship drifting between stars? A lost colony on a planet with no light? The thought made his chest feel heavy. He could almost sense their fear, reaching across the void to him. The next day, Paul took his notes to the university again. He met Professor Grant, a tall man with white hair who had once taught him basic astronomy. Paul explained what he had found, showing the paper filled with repeating sequences. Grant listened politely at first, but soon sighed. "Paul, signals. Like this happen all the time," he said kindly. "Space is noisy. Random bursts can sound like words if you listen long enough. You have to be careful not to imagine patterns that are not really there." Paul felt his face heat with frustration. "But it is a pattern. It repeats. Look here. These 3 words keep returning. It is not chance." Grant shook his head. "I admire your passion, but without stronger evidence, no one will take this seriously." He handed the papers back and smiled as if speaking to a child. "You should get some rest." Walking back through the cold streets, Paul felt a mix of anger and sadness. No one believed him. To them, he was only a lonely man working in an old observatory. But he knew the signal was real. He had seen the structure with his own eyes. More than that, he had felt the desperation inside the sound. It was too strong to ignore. That night, Paul returned to his chair with a stronger sense of purpose. He was alone, but he would not give up. If no one else could hear, then it was his duty to listen. He set up a new system on the computer, programming it to search for repeating cycles. The machine clicked and whirred slowly, but it worked. By midnight, Paul had more results. There were not just 3 words hidden in the signal. There were more. He wrote them down carefully. Help, hunger, darkness, cold, alone. Paul stared at the words. He whispered them aloud, his voice shaking. Whoever was sending this was not only desperate, they were isolated, freezing, and losing hope. He wondered how far away they were. The signal was strong, too strong for something across the galaxy. Could they be nearby? Maybe in the shadow of Earth's orbit? The idea made his skin prickle. He stepped outside the observatory for air. The night was silent, the stars clear above. Paul stared at the sky, wondering which point of light carried the voice of the stranger who called to him. He imagined a ship drifting, its crew waiting for death, whispering into the dark, alone, cold, hungry. His heart ached for them. He could not turn away. When he returned inside, he set up a journal to record every detail. He wrote down times, strength of signals, changes in the words. He wanted a record in case someone, someday, would finally believe him. The longer he listened, the more certain he became that the signal was not only sound. It carried emotion, like an echo of the sender's feelings. Sometimes Paul felt fear rising in his chest while listening. Other times he felt deep sadness, like a wave pressing down on him. He rubbed his face and told himself it was only imagination, but part of him knew it was real. The call was not only technical, it was alive. On the 7th night, something remarkable happened. As the tape spun, the signal shifted. The usual pattern of help, hunger, darkness changed. A new burst appeared, slow and strong. Paul froze, leaning close to the speaker. The sound was rough, broken, but he could almost hear it form. A question. His breath caught. The voice seemed to say, "Who hears?" Paul sat frozen, his heart hammering. This was no longer a plea thrown into the void. This was a message directed at someone. At him. The signal repeated, sharper this time. "Who hears? Who hears?" He swallowed hard, his throat dry. His mind raced. Should he answer? Could they hear him? He looked at the microphone near the console, the one used for local transmissions. His hands trembled as he reached for it, then stopped. What if it was dangerous? What if he brought harm not only to himself, but to everyone? The words repeated, again, heavy with desperation. "Who hears? Who hears?" Paul closed his eyes. No one else on earth cared. No one else believed. If he stayed silent, the voices might fade into nothing, lost forever. He took a deep breath and pressed the button on, the microphone. His voice was quiet but steady. "I hear you." For a long moment, there was only static. Paul's hand shook as he let go of the button. Then slowly, the signal returned, pulsing stronger, almost like a heartbeat. He could not understand the words that followed, but he felt something different, a sense of relief, a connection. Paul sat in the dim light of the observatory, staring at the machines. He knew he had crossed a line. Whatever this was, it was no longer just a mystery in the sky. It was contact, somewhere in the darkness of space. Someone had heard him too. The nights grew longer, and Paul no longer counted the hours of sleep he lost. His life became a rhythm of listening, recording, and waiting. Since the night he answered the signal, the transmissions had changed. The bursts were clearer, the patterns more direct. Though Paul could not understand every word, he felt the messages were no longer blind cries. They were responses. Whoever was out there now knew he was listening. At first, Paul thought the change was only in his imagination, but soon, the signal became stronger at the exact hours when he turned on the machines. It was almost as if the sender knew when he would be there. Paul wrote down every shift, every new word that came through. His notes filled page after page, a growing map of communication between him and the unseen. One cold night, while the stars shone like needles in the dark, something new appeared. As Paul adjusted the telescope, his eyes froze on the screen. A faint blur moved across the edge of the sky. At first he thought it was a satellite, but its path was not steady. It drifted, then corrected itself, then drifted again. The movement looked tired, like a bird trying to stay aloft with broken wings. Paul's heart pounded. He turned the radio dish toward the object, and at once the signal sharpened. The bursts of sound struck with clarity, filled with urgency. The words repeated. Help. Cold. Weak. Hear us. His hands trembled. This was no dream. The source of the signal was not hidden among distant stars. It was here, near Earth, moving just beyond sight. Something or someone was out there, struggling, in silence. Paul leaned closer to the screen. The object glowed faintly, almost invisible against the black. He increased the focus, but the old telescope blurred at high strength. All he could see was a shadowed shape, large and uneven. It did not look like any human craft he knew. The edges seemed too jagged, too natural, almost like wings folded in the dark. His breath caught. Could it be a ship? Or something alive? He shook his head, trying to clear the thought. The idea was too strange, yet the signal and the shape in the sky told the same story. Something was reaching for him from that drifting shadow. That night, Paul did not leave the observatory. He sat in the dim glow of monitors, speaking into the microphone. His words were simple. I hear you. I am here. You are not alone. He repeated them every few minutes, unsure if his voice could truly reach. Each time, the signal responded with stronger pulses, as if the sender understood. Paul felt the distance between them shrink, not in miles but in spirit. As dawn approached, exhaustion pulled at him. He leaned back, eyes heavy, and drifted into a restless sleep in his chair. In his dream he saw them, great shapes with wings spread wide, gliding through endless night. Their bodies were vast, their eyes glowing like fire in the dark. They looked like dragons from old tales, yet they were not of earth. Their cries echoed. Through the dream, the same words he had heard in the static. Help. Cold. Weak. Paul woke with a start, sweat damp on his face. The radio was still alive, the signal steady. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. It had been a dream, yes. But it felt more than that. The images clung to him, too vivid to dismiss. Had they shown him their form? Was this their way of speaking beyond words? The thought sent a chill down his spine, but also a strange comfort. They were not only voices in static. They were beings with faces, wings, and souls. Days passed in a blur. Paul ate little, spoke to no one, and lived in the observatory. The outside world went on with its noise and indifference. But in the silence of the night, a secret grew between him and the voices. Each transmission carried not only words, but emotions that pressed into his mind. Fear, hunger, hope. He felt them as if they were his own. Sometimes he had to step outside, gasping for breath because the weight of their despair was too heavy. Yet he always returned. He could not abandon them. One evening, while the horizon still held the last light of sunset, the signal changed again. This time it was not only words. A long, low tone filled the room, followed by sharp bursts that formed a sequence. Paul froze, as he realized what it was. Coordinates. They were giving him a position. His hands shook as he wrote the numbers down. When he mapped them, his chest tightened. The location was not far, just beyond Earth's shadow side, where sunlight did not reach. The drifting shape he had seen was waiting there. Paul stared at the map, his mind racing. They were closer than he had ever imagined. Not across galaxies, not light years away, but right here in the edge of Earth's space. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. If they were so near, why had no one else noticed? Why had no governments or scientists reported a foreign craft? Unless the others could not hear. Unless the voices had chosen him alone. That night, Paul climbed the observatory's roof. The sky stretched vast above him, cold and eternal. He looked toward the shadowed side of Earth, imagining them, there, hidden and fading. He whispered to the night, his voice barely audible. "I see you. I hear you. Hold on!" As he spoke, the radio inside pulsed with sharp bursts, almost like a heartbeat answering his own. He felt his chest swell with a strange mix of fear and resolve. Whatever they were, they had reached for him. And he, a single man forgotten by most, had answered. Back inside, Paul sat down and wrote in his journal. His handwriting was rough but urgent. He described the shadowed craft, the coordinates, and the vision of winged beings in his dream. He ended with one line written in bold letters. "They are real, and they know I hear them." The night grew silent once more, but Paul felt a new connection in the quiet. He was no longer simply listening to static. He was part of something larger, something hidden just beyond the world's sight. The shadows held secrets, and he had touched them. Paul leaned forward, hands folded, eyes fixed on the steady pulse of the signal. The bond was fragile, but it was there. Somewhere above, beyond the veil of night, the strangers waited. He did not yet know their name or their full story, but he knew one truth. They were alive, they were desperate, and for reasons unknown they had chosen him to hear their call. Paul no longer questioned if the voices were real. Each night proved it again. The signals came with rhythm and feeling, stronger than ever before. What had started as strange static had now become a lifeline between him and something out there, in the dark. He did not know their faces in truth, but the dream of winged creatures with glowing eyes returned again and again. When he woke, the images stayed with him, sharper each time, as if someone was pressing them into his mind. On the 10th night after first answering, the signal changed in a way that shook Paul to the core. He had been recording as usual when a burst of sound carried something different. It was not only words, not only emotion, it was an image. His old monitor flickered as the signal forced its way into the machine. For a moment, the screen was filled with static, then slowly the shapes formed. Paul's eyes widened. A figure appeared, large and dark, wings spread wide across a broken star field. The wings were not thin like a bat's, but layered with strong plates, like armor grown from flesh. The head was long, the mouth lined with sharp edges, and the eyes glowed with a steady inner fire. It was both terrible and beautiful, a creature born for skies far greater than Earth's. His breath caught as the image shifted. More shapes appeared, smaller but of the same kind, their wings folded as if heavy with exhaustion. He counted 5, maybe 6, drifting together in the dark. The vision faded after a minute, leaving only static on the screen. But Paul no longer needed proof. He had seen them. The alien beings were real. He sat frozen in his chair, his heart beating hard. They looked like dragons from ancient tales, yet they were no fantasy. They were alive, wounded, and calling to him. He whispered the name that came to his mind, spoken softly in the silent room. Narak. The word felt right, as if it had been given to him. The next transmission seemed to answer, repeating a sound that matched the word. Paul realized with awe that they were sharing their name, Narak. Over the following nights, Paul began to learn more. The Narak told their story through broken words, images, and the emotions carried in the signal. They had once soared in the skies of their world, a planet of deep caves and glowing rivers. Their wings had carried them through the highest storms, but other species had feared them. The Narak were strong and proud, but they did not seek conquest. When they refused to bow to invaders, they were hunted, pushed from their home. The group Paul had seen was a remnant, survivors fleeing from those who wished them gone. Their ship had been damaged. Energy was nearly gone. They had wandered, searching for refuge, until they reached the shadow side of Earth. But no one had answered their calls. No one, except Paul. Each night as he listened, Paul felt their loneliness, pressing against him. It was not just fear of death, but the pain of being forgotten, of being unwanted in the vastness of the universe. And yet, even as their voices carried sorrow, they also carried trust. They knew him. They believed in him. Paul's days grew harder. The university no longer welcomed his visits. When he tried to explain his discovery again, he was met with pity or dismissal. Some whispered that he was losing his mind. Others laughed, saying he was chasing fairy tales. But Paul no longer cared. He had seen what they could not see. The Narak were real, and their lives were slipping away with each passing hour. One evening, Paul left the observatory and walked to the small diner in town. He sat alone, staring at his coffee, listening to the chatter of people around him. They spoke of work, weather, and the small troubles of daily life. None of them knew that just beyond the reach of the sky, great beings were struggling to survive. Paul felt the weight of the secret pressing on him. He wanted to shout, to tell them all, but he knew they would only laugh again. So he kept silent and returned to the observatory. That night, the Narak's signal was weaker than usual. The words broke often, filled with long silences. Paul leaned close to the speaker, worry in his eyes. "Hold on," he whispered. "Do not give up. I hear you. I will not leave you." The response came slowly, a faint pulse of sound. Then a new word formed, heavy with meaning. Friend. Paul's throat tightened. They were calling him friend. Not scientist, not savior, just friend. Tears stung his eyes as he pressed the microphone button. "Yes," he said softly. "I am your friend." In that moment, Paul felt a bond stronger than anything he had ever known. These beings, feared and hunted across the stars, had found trust in him, a simple man on Earth. And he, ignored by his own people, had found purpose in them. As the hours passed, more images appeared on the monitor. The Narak showed him their world. Dark caves lit by glowing crystals, vast skies filled with storms, rivers of fire flowing across valleys. He saw young ones learning to fly, their wings trembling against the wind. He saw the pride of a people who had never wanted war but had been forced into it. Paul watched in silence, his heart heavy and full. He knew now that their story was not just about survival. It was about dignity, about the will to live free even when the universe turned against them. When the vision ended, Paul sat in the dim light, thinking of what it all meant. No one else on Earth had seen this. No one else had been given their trust. He wondered why it was him, a man with no special title, no great skill. Yet perhaps that was the answer. The Narak had not been answered by governments or armies. They had been heard by a single human heart willing to listen. Paul wrote in his journal late into the night. His words were firm, filled with quiet conviction. They are not monsters. They are not invaders. They are people. They are my friends. As dawn broke, Paul stepped outside. The sky was painted with soft light, and birds called in the distance. For a moment, the world looked peaceful, unaware of the secret waiting just beyond its reach. Paul lifted his eyes to the heavens, knowing the Narak were still there, hidden in shadows, waiting for hope. Paul's life had changed completely. The observatory, once a quiet place for studying stars, had become a bridge between him and the Narak. Each night, he listened to their pulses, their words, and their images. He could feel their exhaustion, and fear as if it were his own. He had seen their world, their struggles, and the shadows in which they now hid. He understood that no one else would believe him. No one else could hear them. But he had a choice. One evening, as the wind blew, cold against the observatory walls, Paul sat at his desk and reviewed his notes. He had calculated the coordinates the Narak had sent him. The drifting craft was just beyond Earth's shadow side, hidden from satellites and telescopes. It was close enough that, with careful planning, he could attempt to guide them. But there were risks. Governments had strict rules about space monitoring. Any strange activity could bring attention and they might respond violently. Paul could be arrested, or worse. Still, the thought of leaving them alone was unbearable. He had come to know their voices, their shapes, and their emotions. These beings were alive and in danger, and he was their only connection to help. The decision weighed on him for hours, pressing on his mind. He could choose safety and ignore them, or he could act, risking everything to save creatures that no one else understood. Paul leaned back in his chair, staring at the blank sky outside the window. He thought of the visions the Narak had shown him, the glowing caves, the rivers of fire, the young ones learning to fly. They had lived with pride and courage before the hunters came. He could not abandon them now. The choice was clear, even if it was terrifying. He would help them. The first step was preparation. Paul began to gather equipment. Old transmitters, antennas, and parts from unused machines filled the observatory. He worked silently, carefully checking each component. He studied orbital maps and readings from nearby satellites. He recalculated the Narak's coordinates again and again, ensuring that his guidance signals would be precise. If he made a mistake, they could drift further into danger. Each night, the Narak responded to his calculations with pulses of emotion. Excitement and hope mixed with fear. Paul could feel their growing trust, their cautious belief that a human might actually guide them to safety. He smiled faintly, though his hands shook with the enormity of the task. He had never done anything like this before. He was a man of quiet life, not a hero of adventure. Yet here he was, planning to reach across the void for creatures unknown, to the world. At times, doubt returned. The world outside the observatory continued as usual. People walked streets, cars hummed past, and news filled the airwaves with stories of human concerns. None of them knew about the Narak. None could imagine. The creatures struggling in the darkness above. Paul felt small, almost foolish in comparison. What if he failed? What if his guidance was wrong? The thought pressed down on him, heavy and cold. But then he listened to their signal again. The word friend pulsed through the speakers. The desperation, the hope, the trust in his ears. It gave him strength. He remembered their shapes in his dreams, their wings folded in fatigue, their eyes glowing with quiet courage. He could not give up. Not now when they depended on him. Paul spent days fine-tuning his transmitter. He adjusted the frequencies so they matched the patterns the Narak used. He wrote codes to translate his guidance into bursts of signals they could understand. It was delicate work. Too strong, and the signal might damage their senses. Too weak, and they would miss it. He checked and rechecked every calculation. His room became a maze of wires, screens, and notes, all converging on one mission: to reach the creatures in the shadowed orbit. At night, he sat in the observatory chair, listening to the signal and watching the monitors. He spoke softly into the microphone, repeating simple words of encouragement. Follow this. Trust me. You are not alone. The Narek's pulses seemed to respond, stronger now, almost like a heartbeat matching his own. The bond between human and alien grew with each passing hour. The choice had become more than a decision. It was a duty. Paul knew he could not turn back, even if it meant risking everything. He thought of what others might say, of the ridicule, the disbelief, and the warnings. None of that mattered. What mattered was life, trust, and hope. He had chosen to be a friend, and now he had to act. Finally, the moment came. Paul activated the transmitter and sent the first guiding signals. His hands shook, but his mind was steady. The Narak responded immediately. The pulses grew stronger, coordinated with the movements he could see faintly through the telescope. Slowly, carefully, they adjusted their path. Paul's calculations were correct. His guidance was working. The observatory was silent, except for the hum of machines and the signal of the Narak. Paul leaned forward, eyes bright and heart racing. For hours he monitored their progress, adjusting signals, ensuring they moved safely toward a secure location. The creatures drifted, wings trembling, but they followed his guidance. By dawn, Paul saw the first signs of success. The drifting shape moved closer to a hidden area of Earth's shadow, away from satellites and observation. The Narak's pulses were lighter, calmer, filled with relief. Paul let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. He had chosen to act, and it had made a difference. He slumped in his chair, exhausted but satisfied. His life had been simple, quiet, and ordinary. Now it had purpose, meaning, and responsibility. He had heard a desperate call, and he had answered. The Narak were not safe yet, but they had hope, and that hope rested in him. Paul closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of the choice he had made. Fear and doubt would always linger, but courage and compassion had driven him forward. He had risked everything to do what was right. In the quiet observatory, with the first light of dawn spilling across the floor, Paul knew one thing clearly. Humanity's worth was not in power or recognition. It was in the choice to care, to act, and to listen when no one else would. The nights had grown colder, and the observatory's walls seemed thinner against the chill. Paul worked tirelessly, eyes fixed on the instruments and screens before him. The Narak were close now, following his guidance signals through the shadowed side of Earth. Their pulses were steady, but he knew they were still weak. Their energy was low, their movements slow. Every moment mattered. Paul had spent days preparing for this night. He had scavenged old equipment from the observatory, repairing transmitters and antennas until they worked better than ever. He had mapped the safest path for the Narak, avoiding satellites, radar, and any observation. He had written codes for the signals to direct their ship and provide real-time guidance. He knew it was delicate work. One wrong move could send them drifting into darkness, lost forever. As he checked the systems again, he spoke softly into the microphone. "This is your path. Follow it exactly. I will guide you." His voice was steady, but his hands shook, slightly. The Narak's pulses responded immediately, stronger now, as if they understood his words not only as signals, but as trust. Outside, the stars were sharp against the black sky. Paul's telescope revealed only faint shadows, but his heart recognized the shapes he had seen before. The Narak were close, and he could feel their presence in the vibrations of the signal. They were real, massive, and fragile at the same time. Their wings trembled even in the emptiness of space, struggling to maintain control. Hours passed in tense silence. Paul adjusted frequencies, monitored the signal strength, and fine-tuned the guidance pulses. Every shift in their movement required precise calculation. He worked faster, carefully observing the patterns of light and energy that indicated their position. The Narak were responding perfectly, moving closer to the safe zone he had calculated. At one point, a sudden interference caused a short disruption in the signal. Paul's heart leapt, and he immediately checked the arrays. A minor solar flare had caused the disturbance, but the Narak had not yet drifted dangerously. He quickly recalibrated the transmitter, sending a stronger, clearer signal. Almost immediately, the pulses of the Narak's response returned, stronger and more coordinated. Paul exhaled slowly. The creatures trusted him. He could not let them down. As the night deepened, the Narak's forms became clearer in his mind. He imagined their massive wings, folded and worn from the long journey. He imagined the smaller ones, young or injured, following the guidance of the stronger adults. He had learned their shapes from the visions the signal had given him. Now he could almost see them in the telescope, even if faintly. He whispered words of encouragement, feeling his voice reach them in ways his mind could not explain. Path is straight. Keep your wings steady. You are safe with me. The hours passed slowly, but progress came. The Narak moved carefully along the path Paul had traced. They avoided the hazards he had feared. Each pulse of their signal became lighter, filled with a sense of relief. Paul could feel it in his chest, a wave of hope stronger than fear. He had guided them this far. Suddenly, the signal pulsed more intensely, almost frantic. Paul checked the readings. One of the smaller Narak had drifted slightly off course, likely exhausted. He quickly adjusted the signal, focusing a stronger pulse toward the weaker creature. The response was immediate. The Narak realigned with the group, moving steadily forward once again. Paul leaned back in his chair, exhausted but relieved. He had saved them from immediate danger. The final stage approached. The safe zone he had identified was a small, hidden pocket of space near the shadow side of Earth. No satellites, no observation, no interference. Here, the Narak could rest, repair their energy, and regain strength. But the final maneuver required precision. Paul focused all his attention, ignoring the fatigue that weighed on him. Every calculation mattered. Every pulse counted. He spoke into the microphone again, softly but clearly. Turn slowly. Align with the safe zone. You can do it. I am here. The Narak responded, their pulses steady and strong now. They had grown weaker over the journey, but the guidance had helped them move as one. Paul could feel the bond between them strengthening. They trusted him completely, and he knew he would not fail them. After what felt like an eternity, the first Narak entered the safe zone. The pulses became calmer, steadier. Relief washed over Paul. One by one, the rest of the group followed. Their wings folded in exhaustion, but they reached the area safely. Paul watched, holding his breath as the last Narak moved into position. Finally, the room was silent except for the hum of the machines and the gentle vibrations of the signal. The Narak were safe for now. Paul slumped in his chair, his body trembling, with fatigue and relief. He had guided them, risking everything, and he had succeeded. He closed his eyes, feeling a wave of connection. The Narak's pulses now carried a new message: gratitude, trust, friendship. Paul smiled softly, tears stinging his eyes. He had done what no one else could. He had reached across the void and saved lives. For hours, he remained in the observatory, listening to their steady, calm pulses. He imagined their forms resting, wings folded, bodies slowly regaining energy. The danger had passed, but he knew the journey was not over. They would need time, care, and perhaps a way to repair their ship. But for now, they were alive, and that was everything. As dawn approached, Paul stepped outside the observatory. The sky was pale, the stars fading with the coming light. He looked up, imagining the hidden forms of the Narak resting just beyond. Earth's shadow, he whispered softly, his voice full of quiet pride. You are safe now. Rest and heal. I will be here when you need me. For the first time in many nights, Paul felt peace. The mission had been dangerous, uncertain, and exhausting. Yet it had brought meaning to his life. He had chosen to act when no one else would. He had reached across space to save beings who could not call anyone else. He had listened, understood, and guided them to safety. The Narak were alive. They trusted him. And in that quiet moment, Paul understood what it meant to be truly human. Courage was not measured by power or weapons. Compassion was not shown in grand speeches or armies. True courage was reaching out when no one else would, risking yourself to save those who could not defend themselves. Paul turned back to the observatory, ready to continue his vigil. The Narak were safe, but their journey was not finished. He would stay with them, guiding, helping, and listening. He had made the choice, and that choice had changed everything. In the shadow of Earth, the Narak rested. Above them, a human watched and waited. A bond had formed, unbroken, strong, and full of hope. Paul had answered the desperate call, and now the rescue was complete. Paul sat in the observatory, exhausted but awake. The Narak were safe in the hidden pocket of space he had guided them to. Their pulses had slowed, steady now, full of calm and quiet trust. Paul felt their presence like a heartbeat in the air. He had spent nights listening to their cries, guiding them through danger, and now he watched them rest. Even though they were safe, Paul knew this was only the beginning. The Narak could not stay in hiding forever. They were survivors, but they needed a future. He thought of Earth, a planet filled with humans who had never noticed the creatures drifting above their heads. Could humanity accept beings so unlike themselves? Could they protect the Narak instead of hunting or fearing them? Paul had no answers, but he knew he had to try. For days, he studied the Narak's signals. He learned more about their communication and their needs. They were intelligent, sensitive, and proud. Their wings were healing, their energy slowly returning. The young ones had stopped trembling, and even the smallest pulses carried strength. Paul felt a deep connection with them. They were not monsters. They were life, beautiful and rare, needing protection from a world that might never understand. One night, as Paul listened, the Narak pulsed a new word, Earth. It repeated, slowly at first, then faster. Paul understood. They wanted to come closer, to explore, to trust humans. But they feared what might happen if they revealed themselves. His heart ached with the weight of responsibility. He had to be careful. One wrong step could destroy their trust and put them in danger. Paul began planning. He mapped the safest approach for the Narak to orbit Earth without being seen by satellites or satellites' shadows. He calculated every risk: weather, lights, human activity, and radar. Every variable mattered. He spoke softly to them as he worked. We will do this carefully. I will protect you. You are my friends. The Narak's pulses responded, steady and reassuring. They seemed to understand his words in ways beyond sound. Paul realized that trust had formed, not through voice or language, but through shared effort and courage. He had been alone when they first reached out, but now he was a bridge between their world and humanity. When the final plan was ready, Paul sent a signal to the Narak. It was a set of coordinates and instructions, precise and gentle. Their pulses replied immediately, a wave of excitement and relief. They were ready. They trusted him. As the Narak moved closer, Paul monitored every detail. He guided their drift through the shadow of Earth, avoiding detection. Their wings shimmered faintly, in the weak sunlight beyond the planet's dark side. He could see their forms through the telescope now more clearly than ever. They were majestic, enormous, and graceful, moving with care and precision. Hours passed in tense silence. Paul adjusted the guidance signal, reminding them of each turn and angle. They followed perfectly, trusting him without hesitation. Every pulse he received carried emotion, hope, fear, determination, and gratitude. Paul felt each one deeply. The Narak were not only survivors, but creatures of extraordinary resilience and courage. Finally, the hidden pocket near Earth's orbit became their new home. Paul watched as the Narak settled, wings folding, bodies glowing faintly from the energy they had restored. Their pulses were calm, steady, and full of life. He whispered to them, his voice soft but full of pride. "You are safe now. This is your place for now. You will heal. You will fly again." The Narak pulsed a single word back. "Friend." Paul smiled, feeling a warmth he had never known. He had been alone, doubted by everyone, yet he had connected with beings from another world. They had trusted him, and he had protected them. The word friend carried more weight than he could describe. It was recognition, gratitude, and connection. It meant that life, no matter how alien, could find understanding through courage and care. In the following days, Paul communicated with the Narak regularly. They shared visions of their world and of Earth from above. He saw mountains, rivers, and forests as they might appear to them. They shared the experience of flying, the thrill of wind against their wings, and the quiet moments of rest in hidden places. Paul felt honored to witness it. He realized that humanity had been given a chance, through him, to see beyond fear and misunderstanding. He also knew that the world could not remain ignorant forever. One day, humans would see the Narak. Paul thought carefully about how to prepare for that moment. He could teach the Narak patience, how to reveal themselves gradually, and he could teach humans to listen. The choice of trust and understanding would define the future. For now, the Narak rested in peace, hidden but thriving. Paul spent hours recording their signals, documenting every pulse, every emotion. He wanted proof, not for himself, but for the future. When humanity was ready, they could learn to see the Narak as friends rather than threats. One evening, as the sun rose over the horizon, Paul stepped outside. The sky glowed faintly, and he imagined the Narak resting in the shadows of Earth. Wings folded, bodies calm. He felt a quiet joy, knowing he had made the right choice. He had listened when no one else would. He had acted when courage was needed. He had become the bridge between two worlds. The Narak's signals pulsed through the observatory, gentle and steady. Paul smiled, whispering softly, "You are safe. You are alive. We will face the future together." He realized that the story was no longer just about survival. It was about understanding. It was about friendship, compassion, and courage. Humanity's answer was not in armies or power, but in the choice to act when life called for help. Paul had answered, and through him, the Narak had found hope. As he watched the sky, Paul knew this was only the beginning. The Narak would heal, they would explore, they would teach and inspire, and one day humanity might finally meet them openly, guided by the understanding and trust that had begun with one human who dared to listen. Paul's heart was full. He had acted when others ignored the call. He had risked himself for the sake of beings unlike any on earth. And in that act, he had proven that hope, compassion, and courage could cross worlds. The Narak were alive. They were safe. And through a human choice, the future had changed.